Thank you everyone for joining us. We're at it again in our 8th installment of the Field Stories. We are so happy today to be here with Laura Thurmann, who is a social anthropologist with a background in comparative literature. She holds a master's in anthropology from the University of Mainz in Germany. I hope I said that right. And she conducted a total of 6 months of fieldwork on police and security in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Niger. Her master's thesis was based on mixed method study of experiences of sexualized violence in fieldwork among German anthropologists. And based on this, she developed a series of workshops on prevention of gendered violence in fieldwork, which is very important. She's currently a PhD student in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Manchester, and her current project focuses on security practices and gendered violence in anthropological fieldwork, which is very related to the topics that we cover. So we're so excited to have her here to delve into that a bit more. Laura, thank you. Maybe you can that was a very short bio. Maybe you can start with going a little more into depth about your research and sort of what I think it was your master's data, what that experience was like, and maybe some of the findings, or in general, what you delved into in that study.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this. I'm really excited to be part of your podcast. So I started fieldwork quite early in my undergraduate degree, and I got the opportunity to conduct 3-month research in the DR Congo on police and security. And this research really got me interested into all issues related to security, violence, and power structures. So coming back from this, I was very, very keen to conduct more research into the same topics or similar topics. And then I got the opportunity to go on a second fieldwork that was initially planned for my master's in Niger. And in this research, security, unfortunately, was not only my topic, it also became quite a big issue for myself. I experienced 2 cases of sexualized violence, and there were also a lot of other smaller situations that were all linked to my gender and my role as a woman, in which I felt threatened or harassed. And coming back from this research, I started to talk about the experiences. I found there were 2 things that I found really striking. The first was a lot of other women also had a story. So it wasn't a single or isolated incident. And the other thing was there were very few people who considered it a research-related or a methodological problem. And I didn't really understand that, because in anthropology, we talk so much about positionality, about our own involvement in the field, our own personalities, and how this is connected to fieldwork. But for some reason, there was almost nothing in methodology, handbooks, or seminars, or even safety trainings, or books on violence. And I found that kind of paradoxical, and I think that got me really interested then, also beyond my own experiences and on a more theoretical and analytical level. So what I did was, because I felt that my research data, because it was so interwoven with strong emotions and it was just a really difficult research, and I felt like I want to write my master's thesis about the topic of gendered violence. But I also didn't want to write a master's thesis about myself, so I did a second study that was a little bit more analytical and a mixed method study with a quantitative part and a qualitative part, where I also compared perspectives from especially women who experienced sexualized violence in fieldwork, but also supervisors who supervised projects in which such incidents had happened.
Wow, yeah, the additional angle of how supervisors are sort of managing sometimes trauma that happens in the field, which they may or may not have training for knowing how to handle, Some of them might have experienced trauma in the field, some of them might not have. And so that idea of training really is more encompassing than just, you know, a quick seminar before you go out into the field. It's much more pervasive about anthropology. In your experience, I'm sure you've interviewed many people. Has training been something that is happening? I mean, we're seeing it happening now. We have trying to do more pre-fieldwork trainings, but in general, it is very striking that such things haven't existed. What has been your experience as a researcher, and or your ideas about why training has not been part of our pedagogy in anthropology?
I conducted this research in 2015. So I think a lot changed because it was before the Me Too movement, and now there are initiatives like yours or Me Too Anthro, or in the UK there are also a couple of new initiatives starting. But so when I did this research, there was not really any training. So first, the research was conducted only in Germany, so among German anthropologists. So I don't know if there were trainings, for example, in the UK, where the university system is very different and the formalized focus on safety and security is a lot different. It's much more formalized than in Germany. But no, there was not really any, so definitely no trainings concerning gendered violence, but there was also not really any training in general about violence or about how to deal with violence or about harassment and all these issues that can make fieldwork really stressful or traumatic.
Yeah, it almost is part of our tradition, seeming that you go out and you endure some kind of very rattling experiences, and this is part of your credentials as earning that degree or whatnot. This very, like, yeah, Indiana Jones idea of anthropology or whatever it might be, whatever field. I think that's one that's shared by many, where fieldwork is proving that you can overcome difficulties and real world situations. And the gendered aspect, which has not been included, is that if you identify as a woman, or in general, if you're a member of LGBTQIA, you know, that there's a added or a heightened risk of sexualized violence more so, which has really been swept under the rug. With individuals that you might have interviewed or encountered, what has been the thing that maybe stop them from, I mean, did you find people leaving the field? I was thinking, we really don't know how many people have left the field or just in general said this, you know, nope, and abandoned their degree or their project. What has been some of your insights with these conversations that you've had in the research about just in general, how this is such a huge barrier?
I think there are different problems. I think, first of all, if you look at when these situations happen, it is very often at the beginning of the fieldwork. And I think there I see a very, very big problem there, because we have so amazing methodology in anthropology, but we don't really talk a lot about this initial explorative stage. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, how can we make this safer? There's this period in which we arrive in the field and we are just told to immerse in the field and to just take part in a little bit of everything. But this can make us very vulnerable in my eyes. Yeah. And I think that's one big part that I've found in my research. And the other thing is that if something happens, it's very difficult to leave, because we have this idea that fieldwork is such a big deal. It's, yeah, as I say, it's just this almost rite of passage thing where you have to go through and to become a proper anthropologist. And if you experience something really, really traumatic or violent or just very stressful and you don't want to continue, I think you see this both in my research but also in publications from the last years, there's often this point where people experience something and then they feel like they either lose the whole research project by saying they had an experience of sexualized violence or harassment or whatever, or they just continue, but then they were afraid that these things might happen again, or they had to change their whole research projects, had to explain it to someone, had to go through an ethical process again. I think these things have to be discussed in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. This is exactly why what we hope to do now, and why we are so grateful for your insights as someone who's especially researching, is just to have these conversations is so important. Just to have the idea before, because it's so much focused on getting the data. Students and researchers, juniors especially, feel that at the end of the day they have to get that data above all means in order to have a project and in order to substantiate whatever research that they're doing. And so having a conversation about, wait a minute, there's also a moment if your safety is called into question, you pull back and you're the most important thing. We've had a lot of pushback, surprisingly, from departments about trainings, about having conversations. People worry that if you talk about it, it's going to dissuade people from doing fieldwork. People worry that, all kinds of things. Have you had any pushback, or have you encountered, or maybe even some of the participants you've interviewed, this push against having these conversations is real, it exists? I'm curious if you've had experience with it since you're doing a project fully on it, and maybe going a little into depth about exactly unpacking why this is such a taboo topic.
Yeah, so I mean, the project I did until now is only my master's project, and I haven't started my PhD research, which will hopefully provide a lot more answers to these questions. But there's definitely a tendency to, not to address these topics. With my workshop, I actually had some positive experiences, but this was also, it was all in Germany. And in Germany, we have a system where we have a students, each subject has a students' parliament, something like this, or a students' council. And these were mostly the people who addressed me and who asked me to do the workshop. I haven't asked departments or to cooperate with departments on a higher level. So I think I don't really have a lot of insight into this now.
Yeah. In that master's thesis, because I think it doesn't matter really if it's a bachelor's thesis, if it's a world experience, if it's a master's, it's still knowledge, right? And so, and I know right now it's COVID times, pandemic, so your fieldwork is yet to take part. Maybe if you can share a little glimpse about what that is going to entail, what you envision for that project for the PhD, because I know it's going to be about sexual violence during fieldwork. So what is sort of the plan now, obviously tentative, about how that's going to take shape?
So I think it really, it starts from the point where my master's thesis ends at some point, because I think there's so many questions. So my master's thesis provided a lot of interesting answers to questions, but it also provided a lot more questions. So that's where I want to start from. And so this new research project will be on, mainly, it will also start with a quantitative study, just to get a general idea of the scope of the problem. But then the main research will be divided into one part focusing onto more individual safety strategies or security strategies that people, and not only women in this time, because I focused on women in my master's, but now I want to get a broader picture of everyone experiencing gendered violence, also in a broader sense, because gendered violence obviously is not only sexualized violence, it can also be just other kinds of violence that are related or that happen because of someone's gender. So there will be this individual part, this part on an individual level that asks about practices, about how individual people deal with research experiences, deal with different, deal with safety in the field. And then there's the more institutional level that looks at what you just addressed. So how do institutions, how do universities, but also other initiatives or external institutions that provide safety trainings. How do all these institutions deal with the topic before, during, and after fieldwork? So I think there's also these, there are these three parts where security strategies can actually work, because obviously you have to do preparation, but then there's also what do you do if something happens,
Right.
and then so how do you address violence in the field, but also how do you support someone who had a violent experience after they come back? So I want to look at all these three parts of security and safety from both an individual and an institutional level.
Yeah, that's such an important note about like the temporality, because when this idea about, okay, it's happened and you survived it and so you just move on, of course we know it's much more complex than that, especially, you know, in the aftermath of the gendered violence. And I'm really glad that you made that note, of that clarifying note, that it's not just, you know, sexual harassment, which is no small thing, but it includes so many things, and it covers all of the gender spectrum. I mean, I don't want people to have this idea like it's just this one. People have in their mind maybe what that looks like when we want to kind of really pluralize this concept of even fieldwork violence, what that might look like. We know even now people are in the field and there's a pandemic going on. It's trauma we think of as any time where there's not feeling safe, right? And how that affects us. And when people come back from the field, it's this idea, yeah, you have to clearly, when a researcher comes back, that's the time to start writing, that's the time to start unpacking the data. That can be very, very triggering. And that aftercare about what people need to feel supported is really, really important. So I'm really glad that you're looking at that, and also that was brought up here, because intervention or emergency help and getting emergency care is one thing, but people have to live after this, and this is something that they have to digest and process. With your time in the field, in your own fieldwork, did you feel that there were spaces for researchers who might have been in a position like you were to reach out? Did you feel that there was someone, did you have a university person or a department that was, because I know oftentimes people don't feel comfortable, even if they exist. There's that feeling like you can't, like you said, you don't want to end the field work, you're invested in it. What do you feel might have been, if you have just sort of an insight on what is something that could be installed or helpful, that maybe if someone in your position would have benefited from?
I think if something happens in the field, it's very important to have a neutral person you can contact. So maybe not your supervisor, maybe also not somebody who grades your PhD or your master's thesis. So it would be great, I think, and there's something that I see that is missing, is that there's maybe an initiative or some office at the university that you can contact that will not, very confidentially, where you know it doesn't have impact on whether you can conduct your research or whether you will be able to still continue whatever you're doing, and also about your funding. I think that's also an issue that many people are afraid of, that they lose their funding because it is very connected to the topic, but the topic is not possible anymore because maybe they were assaulted by a gatekeeper, for example. And I think on this level, it's really important to have somebody neutral. But then also, so there's this whole issue of like mental well-being, but then there's also the question of how do you get support writing about it if you want to write about it. Obviously, you shouldn't force anyone to write about it, but I think there are a lot of people who want to write about it, who want to write about their experience and want to analyze them. But it's very difficult to find people that help you with these academic issues that are also a part of the problem. And and I think so. Looking at the literature at the moment, there's not that much written about it, but there is an increasing body of literature, definitely, and there are more and more women. It is unfortunately only women, I think, until now, who write about their own experience of sexualized violence. And these these articles are so important. I think it's so important that we have these because they help us to understand what is happening. And I think that's also another reason why I want to conduct this research, because if we want to make fieldwork safer, we have to understand what it is that makes it unsafe, and in a way that is more detailed than just talking about all these big structural issues like the patriarchy, which obviously is a big part of it, but there are also all these smaller like power structures or just things that happen on a situational level that we also have to look at. And that's why I think these writing about it is so important. And I'm at the same time, in both of my research, so both women I talked to, but also myself when I came back from the field, there was this idea of maybe you shouldn't talk about it because it could actually damage your career, or it could and it's weird because it is such an interesting topic. Also, it is such a, you can gain so much, so if you want to talk about it or write about it, there are so many important issues in this that can be addressed. But at the same time, for some reason, if you address them, you might lose a lot of like social and cultural capital in academia. And this is, I think there's also something missing, that where do you find support with this? So there has to, maybe something should change there.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of double-edged sword where it's clearly something that needs to be brought into the light, but yet there's a sense that you're being unprofessional when you talk about it, especially because it's regarded as something like a personal problem sometimes. It's like, oh, you're talking about something very personal and that's for you. That's not, oftentimes we see that these stories are edited out of books, or they're just kind of hushed in the sense that scholars are told, that they wouldn't, that they shouldn't really talk about it, or in general, this is a private issue. And I think you alluded to that at the very beginning of this conversation. But I'm really glad just to hear in general that this sort of secondary response about how neutrality is important, because this is what we hope to accomplish with Fieldwork Initiative, that people can come, they can get help. What we often see is that they might go to people and they say, oh, talk to this person in that department and talk to them and talk to them. It's like the buck stops here. You can come. We know we have a lot of lived experience among our members, and in general, we have obviously no power over deciding, and we guide people. But the importance of knowing what does safety look like in the field. There's a lot of confusion about how to get data in a safe way, and this is why the trainings are important. If students knowing, or researchers, or anybody really knowing, strategies, and this is something that we did, is interview people and say, okay, what would you wish you knew before you went into the field that would have helped you maybe. And again, we don't want to put the pressure on actual researchers that if they do something right, it won't happen, or if they dress a certain way, it won't happen. Of course we know not, but just having that toolkit in their mind to be as safe as possible, or just in general have safety in their mindset before going into the field is very, very important. But at the same time, this reluctance of people to feel comfortable sharing their story is, so it's like, this is sort of, maybe explains that pushback. It's sort of the dark side of the moon where, we know it happens and it's kind of hushed about it, but it's not really been addressed in a big topic, which is why research projects like yours are so important. Did you have difficulty getting people, discussing this with folks? I'm sure that with your MA and now coming up with your PhD, the fieldwork yet to happen, but having, it's really, we're talking about trauma, and it can be really, really sensitive and intense, and even the personal toll it might take on you. I mean, we know that compassion and empathetic burnout happens in general. This is no kind of, it's not a small topic. It's not a small thing. It can really be heavy. Did you have any difficulties approaching this, and that people not ready to share yet, maybe, or in general that it might, the idea that it takes a toll on the individual doing this work because it is such a sensitive thing?
I think it is super important to talk, but also to think about these issues. Because I think I at least think so I'm currently involved in some workshops myself to to learn more about dealing with trauma, dealing with trauma-informed interviewing and things like that, because this is important, definitely. When it comes to finding participants, however, I think there's so many people who had experiences and they want to share them, and they find that this is very important to talk about these things. And in my master's, I really had the feeling that the majority, it wasn't super easy to find the people, but it was still, I started research and there were a lot of people just writing me an email or, and saying, hey, I might have a story that might be interesting for you. I totally understand why someone would not want to talk about it, and I think this is very important to respect these decisions. But at the same time, there are so many people who want to change something but don't really know where to start. And I think engaging into discussions, especially on an eye-to-eye level where both experienced some sort of violence, this works quite well, or could work quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. This when Fieldwork Initiative kind of first launched, there was fear because we want to do direct intervention, and we weren't quite sure like what that might look like. Obviously, we have experiences ourselves. We know what's important, but we're unfunded and we don't know. People might need plane tickets and hotel rooms and things. And what I found is that most people who reach out for emergency intervention just want to tell someone what's happening. They just want someone to know what's going on. They don't necessarily want emergency intervention in the sense that we have to rally and make big decisions. They just want a space to say that this is happening to them and feel comfortable that they have somewhere to do it, and know that they're supported in whatever decision they want to make. Because a lot of what we've seen is a lot of researchers, even though I'm sure everybody has their own networks, even speaking with family or friends, this can be difficult because they worry that the family might already be worried that they're going abroad, and that they're going to kind of say, oh, come home immediately, or you're in danger. And in general, they're that agency for them to make their own decisions is quite difficult. But then after they come home, and that's why that temporality you spoke of is important, they might think, like I know myself, I was like, why didn't I just leave? I was totally not in a safe place. And so there's a lot of confusion. And so hearing more stories and hearing these trends is really, really very, very important. In general, just having conversations, which is why this is important, is something that just gets us going in that direction. You mentioned holding a workshop, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what that entailed, or just in general, what was that workshop? Because I think workshops are great, and having these, this is wonderful to have online, but hopefully happening more, at people's universities and having these conversations more locally for folks. Maybe you can go into depth about what that workshop entailed and everything about it.
So this workshop was both based on my master's thesis, but also on general ideas of security studies that I had from my research before. So in this, I'm trying to find a way to how to express this. Security is like a really complex network of a lot of different people. And this workshop is designed to engage into conversation with other people and to discuss their own research projects and think about which people might be part of this security network. So who could be contacted maybe before going in the field, who can be contacted in the field, and who might be there after the field. So also on these 3 levels that we talked about, who are the different people who can help making it a safer situation. So it's not really a workshop that teaches security, and it's more about thinking about security in different ways and thinking about it before. And then another part of the workshop was about how can we write about violence? So what are the different writing styles that are out there already? And also just general ideas of what should we discuss with our supervisors before field work? Should we have an emergency plan? Should we have, so just basically a day of discussing everything safety related with peers, and yeah, with a focus on gendered violence.
Yeah. I really like, I'm so glad I asked you that, because just, I think one of the biggest things is that forethought. If we've never gone into the field, if we've never done a master's thesis or a PhD or whatever it might be, we lack that forethought of knowing the kind of questions and what to wonder and what to know beforehand. And so having a space where students or researchers or whomever, advisors even, are given these questions to think about beforehand, so that they're already in a mindset where they know, okay, if something goes wrong, that if question is so important. And this is not, again, we're always so focused on getting the data and doing the project that often issues of our own safety sort of fall to the wayside, or we just don't think of them. So I really like that, having knowing who would be a safe person to turn to, and even having a bilateral plan with the advisor. This is really great, and I'm really glad you mentioned it, because just to remind people, especially advisors or individuals in those roles that are guiding students, that these questions and these things have to be considered. And when they're considered beforehand, the student is able to already know what to do, or already have sort of an entry into one, that thought, instead of it happening and then that moment of shock and confusion about what now, and that fear about, if I say something could happen. So I'm really glad to hear that. And I think this would be a great thing to encourage others to maybe hope to happen, as well as pre-fieldwork trainings, which are very important. So any final thoughts just in general about this topic? Because again, I think this work that you're doing, you're one of the few that are doing this. I know that people have written articles and such, but a scholar on sexual violence or gendered violence in fieldwork, are there others? We were so happy to find you, just because this is so germane to our focus. And I know that you mentioned there's a bit of a lack of literature, but we know there is a few articles, but they're sort of relegated to blogs or feminist journals and things. What is are you the lone scholar out there doing this specific research on this topic, or what do you know about work that's been done in general about this?
I mean, I haven't met anyone else yet. Maybe there's someone out there that I haven't met yet. I would be very, very happy to meet them. There's this book about harassment from 2 sociologists that came out last year.
Yeah.
So there is a study about that, but yeah, which is only one book, which is not enough. And yeah, no, I don't think there are a lot of people currently doing research with a focus on field work. So I mean, there's obviously a lot of people studying, for example, the relation between academia and sexualized violence on a campus level, but not in field work.
Yeah. That book is that's like our Bible, that's Harassed by Richards and Hansen.
Yeah.
Absolutely, which is really, I think, covering so much ground about what are the things that take place. And also, trauma doesn't have to be specifically, somebody, aggressed against you physically or something. There's many forms, and that they are part of gendered and fieldwork violence. That any time when someone's not comfortable and they're feeling like they have to do something, that's a moment where we need to reflect on. The most common thing we've seen is that research participants, like interviewees and such, they mistake a researcher's interest in their life or their culture or their knowledge of the local with an interest into sort of an amorous relationship, or in general. They really mistake that, and what sort of, this is important to excavate as well, is that harassment, and we study culture, right? And so those nuances about what is how, if we're not within that knowledge of how things are, how they're done, or those signifiers. I know for me personally, I was a single unattached woman working in rural areas that had a signifier I wasn't aware of, because it didn't exist in my context where I'm familiar with. So there's a lot to explore. So we're really glad. And if anyone's out there who's doing the research, please contact Laura. If you're out there, get in touch with her. This is important to make these connections. We really thank you so much for your time and for focusing on this. This is so important, and so I wanted to lead you all the way. Is there any final thoughts maybe you have that you want to discuss, things that maybe are important to state that weren't covered, or just in general, And we'll hand it over to you to say your piece on maybe your project, whatever you have in mind. We're happy to hear any insights you have.
I think what I sometimes find was we discuss so much about how often these things happen, and all these discussions are so much about figures and about percentages and how many women are actually assaulted. But I think if you look at how, especially women, are so socialized into fearing certain types of crime, like assault or rape or yeah, even harassment, that it is not only about things that actually happen, it is also about being on fieldwork and being afraid of these things to happen. And you even have to prepare people for these insecurities. And I think that's very important. So I think what I want to say with it is that it's not only about the, I know, like 7 to 10% who were assaulted in the field, but it's also about the 90% who are afraid of assault in the field. And that's why we need more research and training for this.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful point, is that trauma, even if it's not even if it doesn't culminate into a specific incident, trauma is feeling unsafe, and especially for large periods of time. Even that fear or fear that something will happen is really damaging. It's very psychologically intrusive. It's very it's a very isolating, it's a slew of negative emotions that we've not quite talked about. Sometimes we've seen in the traditional literatures talk about solitude, in the sense that it's a sole researcher out doing work and there's linguistic barriers and things like that. But this time to really go into depth about all of these topics that you just laid in front of us is now, and so it's really important to note. And also, I was thinking, because you spoke specifically about the gendered aspect. Also, the fact that we know men experience gendered violence in fieldwork, that they experience gendered sexual violence, and that lack of space to say anything about it, it's not been, it's still a taboo very much. And so doing a service in general to shedding light on all these topics is so very important. But also that this is exactly what you stated. People come forth and they say, well, yeah, my fieldwork wasn't ideal, it was really scary, but nothing happened, I don't think I qualify for any help with Fieldwork Initiative. And it's like, if you felt unsafe, if you have feelings, if you were in general, this is something that people need help and support for. But also knowing the difference between just in general academics, we don't know what we're kind of doing, or if we're doing ethnography, are we doing it right? There's a lot of blurred confusion. So yeah, that's a really important thing to note. And what do you envision for the future, maybe, of best practices in fieldwork preparation, or in general fieldwork, or what if you could sort of imagine a utopian anthropology, what does that look like as far as safety for researchers?
I think I would like every university to have something like an office or a person who's responsible in anthropology departments that can be contacted. And also having this as a established part of every methodology handbook and every research preparation seminar or training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It is really important to create space for this issue, and without that space, people don't feel comfortable. So that's a wonderful place to sort of lay us down here. You mentioned Me Too Anthro. I want to shout out to them. Those are our darlings. They do wonderful work. There's a new fieldwork network for members who identify as queer or LGBTQIA, which is coming off the ground, and I want folks to be connected with that. That's very important. We want to look at all the specialized nuance that is embodied in research fieldwork, and how it might, all those barriers exist differently for different folks. And so knowing what those are, and having, specific people to go to and know where to get help and networks and such. And there are others. I think I know there is the mentoring in the UK. I know there's groups, and also I think in Germany, do there exist specific groups that we don't yet know about? Maybe you can connect us with them.
Not seen one yet, no.
Hey, so
maybe I'll start one.
I was gonna say, looking at you, I know two German scholars who are just absolutely wonderful, Dr. Sina Klaas and Lisa Schneider, who do work on this. They've written on this, and So this is, we want as many, I really feel like as many entities pop up and are born, it's safety. I think it really is. And it really goes against this myth that this is not common when we know that this is incredibly common. And getting this into the meat and bones of academic conversation. So thank you for helping us do that today. Again, Laura Thurmann is about to depart on her fieldwork shortly. When is the timeline? I know it's in COVID time, so everything's tentative, but
should start in November.
okay, in November. So we're really looking forward to everything we can learn from that work and in general from you. And thank you so much again for doing this.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thanks. Anybody who might feel interested to connect with you, maybe we can make that happen. You can reach out to us and we can triangulate. But this is now sort of something that we are sort of handing it over to all the listeners and encouraging folks to, these workshops that you mentioned are wonderful. We really want to do more about this topic. So thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us in this 8th installment. We are looking forward to carrying it forward. And so we're going to sign off now and hope that this has got some thought-provoking ideas of what work can be done on the ground and also conversations that can be had about fieldwork violence.